Welcome to the ongoing series of online discussions hosted by the Yale School of Management Office of Alumni Relations and QN, the Yale School of Management magazine. Today's conversation is Women and Leadership. Our moderator is Victoria Breskel, Assistant Professor of Organizational Behavior, who will introduce our panelists and kick off the discussion. Tori's research focuses on the impact of stereotypes on individuals' status within organizations, particularly the status of individuals who violate gender stereotypes. We welcome your participation in today's discussion. You can submit questions and comments through the question box on your screen. Now I'll turn things over to Tori.
Thank you, Ben. I also just want to say how excited I am about being invited to participate in this panel. We have three very distinguished guests, all of whom are Yale alums. And so I will just start by introducing them and then open it up to their own personal experiences in light of the research that I've done. So first we have Beth Axelrod, who is the Senior Vice President of Human Resources at eBay. And she is responsible for all aspects of the company's human resource capabilities. And she also has mentioned to me that she has a lot of ideas about sort of gender diversity in the workforce. Secondly, we have Linda Mason, who is on the Yale Corporation and is also a Yale alum. And chairman and founder of the Bright Horizons Family Solutions Group. And it is the largest worldwide provider of worksite child care and early education. And then we have Brandy Stellings, who is at Catalyst and also a Yale alum. She's a lawyer who leads Catalyst's efforts to advance women and promote inclusion within the legal profession. So I would just first like to start off with one question for all of the panelists, and you can answer in any order that it makes sense to you. But my work and my research has shown that on average, people have some deeply ingrained beliefs that men are more suited to leadership roles than women, in part because they're seen as more agentic, assertive, and competent. And so just to kick things off, I was wondering if the panelists could talk about if they had experienced any of these gender biases in their own jobs, and if they did, how do they handle it?
This is Beth. I'll jump in first. I'd like to first start by saying that I personally believe the research findings that you just cited in general, and we've examined them as a leadership team at eBay reasonably closely. We are socialized in ways that lead us to unconsciously have beliefs around the roles that men and women should play as it relates to leadership, and when either gender plays a role that's different than what we expect, we react in particular ways. And what I think is very interesting about the research is because men and women are socialized around the same stereotypes, we actually have similar reactions. And so it's important to recognize that these behaviors aren't simply what men do to women in the workplace, but it's how both men and women perceive men and women in the workplace. And so having just a higher degree of awareness and consciousness around that allows us to take more deliberate steps to mitigate some of that behavior. As it relates to my own experience, just to date myself, I started my career in the 1980s working for an investment bank in mergers and acquisitions. And my first day on the job, which was my first professional experience, was a very exciting day for me, and I thought carefully about how I was going to prepare for that day and put on one of my brand new blue pinstripe suits. And showed up at the investment bank, walked into the elevator, and one of the male bankers held out his hand and said, "Hi, my name's Scott. You must be a new secretary." And that was my first day on the job. I'm happy to say that the world has moved on since then, and the gender bias isn't quite as overt. But I think it's important for us to recognize that we do hold beliefs in our minds that we need to become more conscious of, so that we don't just make assumptions about people's roles or their ability to have impact in organizations.
This is Brandy Stelling from Catalyst. And there's so much to say, so I'll try to be brief. And for those who aren't familiar with Catalyst, we're a nonprofit research and consulting about women in the workplace. And so these issues are very close to ones that we study in our research, but also that we hear from the corporations that we work with. And I agree with both Tori and Beth's points. We have a series of research about stereotypes in the workplace, and it's exactly as you say, and it's partly that when people think about a leader, they think of a man. And so this stereotype really puts powerful women leaders into a double bind that is seen as too much like a typical male leader or too different from one. And as you say, we're all susceptible to them, products of socialization and other things as well. And if people aren't familiar with Dr. Banaji's research about the implicit association test, that can be kind of a I was going to say fun, but fun may not be the right word, but an interesting test to take on the website. And she did one about associating career with women, and actually women were even less likely than men to associate career with women. So certainly in our work and our research, we see this double bind in operation all the time.
Yeah, and I think sorry to interject right now, but I just want to say that all the research actually, I worked with Professor Banaji as a graduate student, and certainly it's the stereotypes are all culturally driven, right? So they are the result of beliefs that we all sort of are raised with. And so this is not surprising. It's not about somebody being bad or good or men sort of discriminating against women necessarily, but rather the research shows that it's both men and women that have the same beliefs.
So this is Linda, and this conversation has made me think back to my very first position out of Yale School of Management, where I had accepted to go work at Booz Allen in Hamilton, but the last year that I was at SOM, 1979-80, was the year the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia, ousted the Khmer Rouge, and a huge humanitarian crisis ensued. And so myself and two other classmates went over to the border of Cambodia and Thailand and worked in the refugee camps for a year. Now, in 1980, the world of relief work was extremely male-oriented, macho, very much sort of a cowboy mentality. And I was shocked at just the way the atmosphere was amongst the relief workers. That was a very macho atmosphere. And I remember feeling so incensed at the way men would treat their fellow workers, female workers. And so being young and immature, I decided to use their techniques against them and with them. And so I started interrupting men when they would talk, started using declarative sentences instead of questioning sentences. And then I realized, and even looking them up and down as they spoke, trying to use some of their tactics, which I felt were really demeaning against them. And then I realized, that's not a very mature way to operate. And started to just relax into my role. And, there's so much to say about that, but I'm going to quick fast forward to two other experiences that were really different as far as gender. Then, a few years later, I was co-country director for Save the Children in the Sudan. So being the leader of an organization in a very conservative Islamist environment that practiced Sharia law, you would think that it would be very, very tough to be a woman in a leadership position there. But I actually found the fact my differentness actually turned out to be an advantage. I wasn't a male, obviously, but I wasn't like any female. This was in 1984-85, wasn't like any female that the Sudanese were used to interacting with. So I was in this different category that seemed to be neither male nor female, which actually turned out to be quite an advantage as far as giving me a pretty wide range of freedom in the way I operated. And then fast forward.
Linda, could you speak more about that, please?
Yeah. So, operating, this is 1984 to 86 in northern Sudan, which was very conservative Muslim Sharia law country. Incredibly lovely people, but very, very rigid gender roles, and certainly no or very few women in any leadership position. And so here is a crisis, a large famine, so an influx of Western relief workers. And many of the men suffered under the suspicion of the Sudanese sort of carrying the old colonial white man cloak, and were viewed somewhat with suspicion and at arm's length, even though they may have been relief workers doing great work. Whereas myself, I being there as a woman, where they had almost no familiarity of responding to a woman in a leadership role. I did all the negotiation with the Sudanese, with the government to get a country agreement and trucking arrangements, and I wasn't met with suspicion. I was met with more curiosity and respect and kind of confusion in a way, and which was actually turned out to be a wonderful asset for me, where I could sit and actually create relationships of respect and didn't have to operate under any old generalization, because I was in a very new kind of category for them. So maybe I'll stop there, and I could talk a little bit later about the culture of Bright Horizons, which is almost entirely female, so it's a very different
We
culture.
would love to talk about Bright Horizons, absolutely. I'm just, Brandy, I'm curious, sort of what is the work that you're doing right now at Catalyst, and sort of how do you see your firm, your nonprofit firm, contributing to the work on women in leadership?
Sure. Thanks, Tori. And I just wanted, Linda, your comments reminded me, although totally different setting, reminded me of a panel I was moderating a couple weeks ago. One of the panelists was a very senior trader at a big bank. And when thinking about these issues, she thought that it was ultimately an advantage for her in some ways to be a woman, because that field is so male-dominated that everyone knew who she was because you look out on the floor. So all the managers, supervisors knew who she was. So that can be a mixed blessing, because I'm sure, Tori, your research and a lot of the research shows stereotypes, of course, are more salient when there are fewer people there, and then you become sort of the represent woman or the representative minority. So it can be a big burden to carry, but it also can sometimes be an advantage when visibility is so key to getting ahead. But in terms of Catalyst, I was also thinking too, as Beth and Linda were talking about their first experiences in the workplace, and Catalyst started 50 years ago and really focused on helping getting women in the workplace. So I was thinking about how our focus has shifted over time, and really focused on helping women, get their resumes polished, find jobs. There was some controversy and there's focus on part-time work, and I'm sure we'll come back to that later. And then after 25 years, we realized that our focus was somewhat misplaced, because we were really focused on fixing the women. And we realized that we actually really needed to fix the workplace. The effect of all of these stereotypes and expectations and so forth. And, obviously I think Bright Horizons has been in the solutions business as well to fixing some of these issues. And I know eBay is working on them as well, so I'd love to hear more about that. So we've really focused through our research to try to bust myths that people have about women in the workplace. So all of the research is on our website. It's free, and the one that might be most interesting to people on this call is a high potential series that we've been following, a longitudinal study of MBA grads from around the world and looking at their experiences in the workplace. And there's a lot to say about that, but the only thing I'll say at this point is that when we started it, Catalyst had always, in some ways been thinking about the glass ceiling and the idea that women really encounter barriers as they move up. And so we did a threshold. We wanted to see what happened to men and women right after they graduated with their MBA. So it's a very similarly positioned population. And we weren't looking for a gender gap right out of the gate, but we were quite surprised when we found one. And we found that even in that very first job post-MBA, women lagged men in compensation and in terms of job placement. And then we controlled for a lot of the variables that are the conventional wisdom about why women don't get ahead, and a lot of it relating to choices, et cetera, that people think women are making. And even when we control for those factors, such as parental status, having children, and so forth, ambition, we still found that the women lagged the men. So I'll stop there because I'm really interested in hearing everyone else's experiences.
Yeah, well, Beth, could you talk a little bit more about what your initiatives are at eBay, please?
Sure. I'll just pick up on one thing that Brandy said, and then I'll describe what we're doing at eBay. So I completely agree, and I see in my HR role how the behavior of men and women differs when they're entering the workplace, and I had particularly around negotiating compensation. So I personally negotiate the offers for every senior leader who joins our company, and so I have a lot of data points of observation. But I had the opportunity to actually provide some coaching to a former colleague of mine at my former employer who was moving jobs, and she called me up and said she was moving roles, and she described the job that she had. She asked me to serve as a reference, which I did because she was in HR and I knew the head of HR of that company, so I provided her reference. And they made her a really wonderful offer, and she called me up and she told me the role as well as the compensation. And I said, wow, that's a really fantastic offer. What are you going to ask for? And she said, well, I'm not going to ask for anything. It's a great offer. Don't you think it's a great offer? And I said, it is a great offer, but do you really think that they put the last penny on the table that they're prepared to pay to have you join their company, since they clearly want you? And she said, yes, but it's a good offer. And I said, I want you to go away and think about how this compensation package compares to what you've got, and find one gap in their offer and ask for it, ask them to close that gap. And so she called me back the next day, and she, with a lot of trepidation, said, well, here's one gap I see that I could ask for. And I said, that's fantastic. Why don't you call them up and ask for that? And she called them up and she asked, and sure enough, they met her request without hesitation.
Right.
And so I think Brandy's, the research that Brandy's highlighted plays out in many different ways. And women generally, in my observation, under-negotiate their offers relative to men, and leave money on the table early in their career, which then compounds. That gap compounds over time, because each time an individual moves jobs, the new employer keys their new compensation package off of a combination of what's the market benchmark, what are internal people making, and what is the individual's current compensation. So that gap compounds, and my encouragement to everybody on this call who's contemplating a job move is to negotiate your package, and know that if you're feeling uncomfortable about it, you're probably not close to crossing the line of what would be perceived as unacceptable behavior around negotiating compensation. As it relates to eBay, so about late 2010, our CEO, who's a tremendous proponent of enabling women to build lasting careers, declared that this would be a company priority. And we have had now, so that was late 2010, so we're nearly 2 years into our effort where he has personally carried goals around gender diversity and the objectives that he shares with our board of directors. And we have taken a series of steps to try to raise awareness around the importance of enabling women to build lasting careers so that we can tap into this incredibly vital talent pool for our organization, which we are confident helps drive performance in our company. And through a series of initiatives and focus on what I would describe as some very basic things around recruitment and around career development, we have in the last 19 months increased the number of women in leadership roles by 81% and increased the proportion of women in leadership roles, meaning we have grown the number of women in leadership roles faster than the rate we have grown men leaders, and as a result have a greater proportion of women in leadership roles just in actually a 19-month period. And I think and I can later, if you'd like, Tori, talk about some of the specifics, but I think what it demonstrates is that with visible and sustained senior leadership commitment and focus on some very basic things, a company can move the needle on women in leadership roles fairly quickly. And then I think what comes after that and the stage that we're moving in right now is the harder work. And the harder work is around some of the cultural change that's necessary to sustain those gains.
So, Beth, what specifically have you done in EB that would lead to this?
Sure. So I can give you the highlights of the things that we've done.
Basically, what I'm going to get asked by my students, and yes.
Go ahead.
Well, the things that I would say that have mattered most. So, my observation about us and other companies is when a company declares a priority, there's a flurry of activity that people with the best of intentions want to undertake. In our case, I think I would name 4 things that I think have really made a difference. Number one, first and foremost, is visible senior leadership commitment and support. I don't think there's anybody in our company that isn't clear about our CEO's conviction around gender diversity and enabling women to build lasting careers. He carries objectives. All of our SVPs have carried objectives, and starting in 2013, all of our VPs will carry objectives around this. That's number one. Second, which is very basic and important, is around recruitment. He declared that we will have a diverse slate of candidates and a diverse slate of interviewers for all open leadership positions. And simply, if you have no women on the slate, you will not hire a woman. If you have at least one woman on the slate, you might hire a woman, and so make sure the slate is diverse. Third was around career development. We've done 2 things. We've made sure that our women all have career development plans and that they are having very deliberate career conversations with their managers. And the second is we've taken a much more disciplined approach around our organization and talent review process as well as our promotion process to make sure that we are not making assumptions about women's career aspirations, but we're making informed decisions based on conversations we've had with them.
Sure.
And then the 4th thing I would call out is just measurement. We measured our starting point. We measure the progress twice a year. I review that data with our CEO, and we talk about it at every forum that we convene with our leaders. We put gender diversity on the agenda, and we share the metrics.
Is it public?
It's not public, and that's actually a very interesting question. It's not public, and my observation is that most companies don't even share their data internally, and they don't, I think, largely for legal reasons. And because it's considered very highly sensitive data, but what the beauty of sharing data, and we don't share our data publicly. Obviously, I've named a few statistics that I'm comfortable sharing, but we share it internally, and I put all the numbers up on the screen because first of all, you have to be able to measure progress, and second of all, when you share data openly inside the company, it establishes a tremendous sense of accountability.
Beth, how are you, this is Linda, how are you now approaching the more ingrained cultural obstacles for progressing in diversity? You said that's been the hardest part.
This is the harder part. I mean, what I would say is, our numbers are, we don't set quotas, but even if we did, we would not have had the audacity to set numbers that are as good as what we've achieved in 24 months. And I would say those were the easy wins, the early and easy wins. The harder part, I think our numbers are ahead of the cultural reality, because the cultural reality comes back to comments that we've already made on this call, but Tori and Brandy, around just the socialization that's in place and the unconscious bias that's in place in organizations, and also cultural norms that make it difficult for men and women to have the conversations that they need to have in order to figure out how to make work and their personal life work for them. And so the thing that we've just done, which again is very simple, but we had our global vice presidents and above meeting last week. And of course we talked about gender diversity and objectives for 2013. And what we added to the list is something that we call inviting the conversation. And we simply were trying to make the point that right now it feels too difficult and too risky to have the real conversation, whatever the real conversation may be. And that real conversation might be around the role I would next like to have in the company, the move I'd like to make to a different department, the flexibility I need to be able to show up to work a little bit later because I am dropping my kids off at school. Or the flexibility I need to just take care of aging parents. And so what we're trying to do is acknowledge that those conversations sometimes feel risky, and also acknowledge that many people managers do not feel equipped to have those conversations and problem solve with the employee who initiates the conversation. And that what we're asking our leaders to do is to recognize that, invite that conversation, and begin the dialogue at all levels of the company that will enable women, but also men, to thrive in our organization.
I'm going to pose a question for all the panelists right now, and that in my experience has come up with female MBA students again and again, and I'm not surprised actually that so I don't know if you guys know, but like I have like questions posed to me right now online, and I'm supposed to ask you them. And one of the questions, and I think it's an interesting one, and I don't really know how to answer it. I have data on this, but I'd rather hear from the experts on the panel, which is whether it's a good idea for women to display their femininity or sexuality at work. Is that something that is helpful or not helpful or good or bad?
So this is Beth. I'm happy to jump in. I'm smiling hearing that question, because the question that that I think a lot of us have considered in our careers, and the answer is kind of it's a tricky, uncomfortable answer that I'll give, which is that there's pretty interesting research that says that that people ascribe authority around two dimensions, and it's competence and likability.
Yep.
And men and women behave similar to each other in how they ascribe authority to a man or a woman, but we ascribe it in different ways to men and women. And they're kind of positively correlated with men, which means that if we think the man is highly competent, we also think he's likable and we would want to work with him. And if we think the woman is highly competent, she's probably not all that likable and we probably wouldn't want to work with her. And so it kind of puts women in a difficult situation. Brandy talked about the double bind for women. And so likability matters. People wanting to work with you actually matters, and that's part of the way that authority gets ascribed. And likability comes in the form of some very typical, gender dimensions. And so there is an argument to be made that if you make yourself likable in the workplace so that people want to be on your team, that's helping you on one of the dimensions of authority. But you've got to walk the fine line, because too much likability leads to a perceived lack of competence.
Right.
Yeah, this is Brandy. I completely agree with what Beth just said and said so well. And we really see often that women leaders are perceived as competent or likable, but rarely both. And just that in general, women are subject to more social disapproval, and this double bind, these stereotypes are tough because if women act in ways that are inconsistent with gender stereotypes, then they're considered unfeminine. But then if they do act in ways that are consistent, then they're not seen as leader-like, and it's difficult. So I'm not sure if that's answering the question in the sense that it's definitely understand where it's coming from, but I think that everyone in these situations navigates these double binds, and you have to work in a style that ultimately is authentic for you, I think.
Yeah, I think
this is Linda. I just wanted.
It's something that in the 5 years I've spent as a professor at Yale, it keeps coming up over and over and over and over and again. And I don't know, there isn't really clear research. I think the likability and competence stuff is extremely important, very familiar with it. That's what I do most of my work on. But I don't have a lot to say about young women who are sort of trying to navigate these roles, and I'm just curious about your own experience in navigating that issue.
So this is Linda. I'm going to talk from more of a personal perspective, since we don't do research on this, but I spent a number of years working in management consulting, starting out with Booz Allen and Hamilton, and I was always struck by the fact that when you went into senior managers' offices, they did have photographs of their families, like pointed on their desk, pointed out towards the guests who were sitting there, whereas many of the women had pictures of their family that they could gaze at while they sat behind the desk. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And when we created Bright Horizons, we're predominantly a female employee organization. We now employ about 22,000 people. Almost all of them are women, all the way up through our senior ranks. We do have men, of course, but our president, our chief financial officer, 9 of our 10 divisional vice presidents are all women on all the way down. And right from the beginning, I wanted to make sure that it was an environment where it was okay to be a woman. And so this is answering that registrant's question in a little bit different way. But I got pregnant with our first child just a year into the founding of Bright Horizons, and I wanted to be able to embrace my whole role as mother as well as worker, and very consciously created an environment where you could talk about your children, you could cry in a meeting, you could be a mother, you could be nurturing, and our culture is very, very much a nurturing culture and has really embraced the more classic feminine attributes. And I know without a doubt that plays a very large role in people wanting to work for us and people being very loyal to us and being a great place to work. For 13 years in a row, we've been on the Fortune magazine list of the 100 best places to work in America, and that's our most valued recognition. And I think a big part of it is people are respected and honored as a whole person.
This is Beth. I just want to jump in with a kind of two personal anecdotes around that. About 5 years ago, so I was at eBay at the time. I had to give a little talk to a group of people, and during the break, a woman kind of hurriedly came over to me and clearly had an important message or question. And she made a comment that really surprised me. She said, I know that you spent a long time in your career at McKinsey & Company, and you were a partner at McKinsey. And so I had an idea in my mind of what your leadership style was going to look like. So she said, your communication style wasn't what I expected. And I said, well, what did you expect? And she said, well, frankly, I expected something very male. And so that was kind of interesting, and I was thinking, I wonder what that means. And so I asked her what that means, and she started to describe very structured. But then she said, you are very expressive when you communicate and have a lot of enthusiasm and passion. And I don't think about that being a typical communication style in the workplace, and particularly not for somebody who is a partner at McKinsey. And I said to her, and I really appreciated her coming up and making that observation and sharing that comment with me, because it's something that I hadn't really thought a whole lot about. But as I reflected on it, what I realized is that at my time at McKinsey, I did work pretty hard to conform, generally speaking, to a communication style norm, which was very typically male and defined by a consulting environment. And in the latter part of my McKinsey career, and then certainly after I left, I felt very liberated to actually morph that back to something that was much more authentic to me. And so when I speak publicly or in meetings or at work, the person who speaks is Beth Axelrod. It's not the professional version from 9 to 5. It is Beth Axelrod. I speak the way I feel. I speak with passion and conviction for things that I care about, and I do it in a way that is a voice that's authentic to mine. And I would say that I believe that this communication style is the one that has the greatest impact. And the question was much more about appearance, and so I'll just comment on that. I mean, I think it's really important that we all show up at work being the person that we are. And so I do not dress like my male colleagues. I dress in a decidedly female way, but I dress in a way that works for me. And what works for me personally is I want to be perceived as a professional and a competent senior leader in this company. So I dress well. I'm generally, I would say, better dressed than my male colleagues. That's very deliberate on my part, because I know that people don't naturally ascribe leadership authority to women, and so I make sure I dress the part every day in case there's any doubt in their minds. You find that my male colleagues dress much more casually. But I make a choice to not dress in a way that is overly revealing, and that's a personal choice, because I think that being a female in a senior leadership position is tough enough. It doesn't need to be complicated by a heavy measure of my femininity or sexuality in the workplace. And so I personally choose to leave that outside of work, but it's a personal choice.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly in line with all the research that's been done on this issue. And I've done a lot of this research myself. And essentially, any sort of mention of women's physical appearance actually can be quite harmful to women. But I'd also like to just kind of refocus the conversation just for a second, or maybe for the rest of the time, about families and how you all have managed to either have kids, not have kids, and Linda, obviously you have a lot of knowledge about this, but if we could just talk about that, I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's such an important topic for us to discuss. This is Linda. And I remember early on, I have 3 children, and I remember when they were young. Now they're 24, 21, and 16. But when I had 3 little ones at home, I was just, totally harried and guilt-ridden and wondering if I was doing the right thing. And much of what I had to do is go visit our centers and meet with parents who are using our centers. And I always was fascinated by, in every group of parents, most of us looked really harried and exhausted. These are all parents with very young children. But there always seemed to be a mom or two who had it all together, who just really seemed to be thriving and put well together, and she was happy and her children seemed happy. And I became fascinated to find out what are their secrets and strategies. How are they able to thrive? And I think I have a little bit of a voyeuristic part of my personality. I love to peek inside other people's lives. And so I set about this project to interview moms that had figured out how to do it all well. And so with our national team of parent advocates, I had them select moms who they knew were doing well at work, and who we knew, because we care for their children, that their children were thriving and they were doing a good job with their kids. And then I set about interviewing each one of these 100 women over a number of hours. And it was a very, very diverse group, socioeconomically, lifestyle choices, single moms. A third of them were single moms. And what I found that they, even though they're very, very different in income and lifestyle and ethnically, socioeconomically, they did have 3 basic areas in common that I felt allowed them to thrive at work and at home. And I called these things the 3 pillars of successful working motherhood. And the first is excellent child care. No parent can feel good at work if they're worried about what's going on with their children. And excellent child care can be a center, a nanny, a relative, a family daycare home. The second was a partner in parenting, and that's whether you're married or single. So I think for us to know we don't have to do it all alone. It really does take a village to raise a child, and it's great for children to have multiple adults who love them and look out for them. And so this partner in parenting could be a spouse, a best friend, a relative, a mother, a brother, sister, but someone who could share the joys and the responsibilities of caring for your kids. And I remember once Barry Brazelton, a great child development specialist and pediatrician, saying children, unlike adults, thrive on multiple lovers. And I just loved that comment, because we've seen that as well too with the children in our centers, that children have a firmer sense of security and that the world is a good place if they're adults who really adore them and look out for them. And then the third pillar of support that's essential is a supportive employer. And that can be hard to find, particularly in our culture, which is not a very family-friendly culture. But even in corporations or workplaces that aren't known as a whole to be family-friendly, if many of these women had found specific supervisors within those organizations that were supportive of them as whole people. So it really comes down to support and not having to do it all on your own. So excellent child care partner in parenting and supportive employer.
Thank you, Linda. Beth and Brandy, do you have anything to say about that?
Sure, this is Beth. I'll jump in here, and I should say, so I am married, and I am the mother of two. My boys are now both teenagers. And Linda, it's so interesting to hear your 3 pillars because they resonate so much in my own life experience. So I find that what I like to tell women is, we all tend to be really thoughtful about picking our jobs, and it's really important to be extraordinarily mindful in picking one's life partner, because that person, the criteria that we use at the time we're making that choice, which tends to be relatively early in our lives, is not necessarily the criteria that will be most important over the course of one's life together. And having a life partner that's supportive of the family choices, that takes on a share of the parenting responsibility and is supportive of one's career is so incredibly important, but not necessarily the criteria that we know to look for at the time we're falling in love with somebody. And so I say pick your life partner very well. I have a spectacular husband who is wonderfully supportive on each of those dimensions. I had both of my boys while I was at McKinsey & Company. And so Linda's comment about the employer really resonates for me to choose a company that will support the family life choices that you're going to make. In my case, I made a fairly unconventional choice. I took off 10 months with the birth of both of my children, rather than the more conventional alternative, which was to take off a much shorter period of time and come back to work part-time. I took off 10 months, which was very uncommon back then, and then came back full-time. And for me, that was absolutely the right choice, and I was appreciative to be at a firm that would accommodate that choice. And as a partner in McKinsey, if disappearing for 10 months did mean I had to give up my client portfolio, somebody else had to serve the clients. But I also came back and was extraordinarily well sponsored in rebuilding my client portfolio. And so being in an organization that will provide that level of support is really important. And then the third thing that Linda said, I totally connect with, which is I personally found it impossible to concentrate at work if I had any doubts about how my children were being cared for at home. And so having fantastic childcare that will provide the kind of safe, loving, nurturing environment that I would have done had I been the one at home was critically important. And finding that is not trivial, as Linda very well knows. Finding that is not trivial, and that will look differently for different people. For some people, it's family members that will do that. For some people, it's tapping into other resources that are available. But having childcare that gives tremendous peace of mind is really critical to being able to show up focused at work. And that's something that I think inevitably has ups and downs, and you have to be prepared to navigate the downs, as the ups are great, and when it's down, it requires immediate attention, and recognizing that and taking care of it is what I think enabled my husband and I both to have peace of mind that our kids were well looked after.
Brandy, do you?
Yeah, definitely. I was sitting on the edge of my seat to hear Linda's 3 pillars. So interesting. And Beth, what you say. Yes. Beth, and let me just step back and say I have 2 children, aged 12 and 9. And I also was thinking about what you said, Beth, because when I first joined Catalyst, of course, we have a lot of events, and I go to a lot of events focused on women's leadership. And I was really struck when hearing from, we have a lot of women CEOs keynote, and there was this pattern in their remarks. A lot of things that were different, but one thing that was similar was they talked a lot about being, careful about your life partner and who your partner is or who you marry. And I hadn't really thought about it before, and it it does seem really important. What I think is difficult on that part, I think my husband does a great job. I think what's unfortunate is the expectations from society and the rest of the world are so low. So he is congratulated all the time for taking the kids to the pediatrician, whereas I do that all the time and nobody says boo. And just simple things that, I live in Manhattan on the Upper West Side, and my children's nursery school, they send all the emails to the mothers only. And, this is, the 2000s on the Upper West Side. And I talked to them about it, because we would like to be co-parents, but if I'm the only one getting the emails, and they said that it just wasn't technically possible to send it to both parents. Eventually they did. But I just think there's a lot of social engineering that makes it hard, that you have to sort of be clear about what you want to do. The other thing I would say, too, is thinking about that, I took 3 months off with each children. I was at NBC when I had my kids, and they were terrific and wonderful. So back to that pillar about the good employer, and Catalyst obviously really walks the talk as well. But my old boss at NBC talked about what she called the F word, and what she meant by that was full-time. And she was so right, because I remember when I would talk to people at school or other places, they'd be sort of surprised, oh, you're working full-time. And there was sort of an assumption built in, I think, of, oh, you're neglecting your children, or two, your husband can't support you. So I think that those 3 pillars sound absolutely right, but there are still all these social barriers for women and for men as well. I certainly recall at my law firm, which had fairly generous at the time paternity leave benefits, but a lot of the men didn't take it, not because I don't think they wanted to spend some time with their children, but because people were really watching, and they felt that they were subject to a higher level of scrutiny in a way.
Yeah, no, and again, just like to interject the research on this issue. Certainly men are seen as less masculine and less hireable, less competent when they do take, family leave or take advantage of these policies. And so we're stuck in this really difficult position where we don't know basically how to, get gender equality in terms of childcare, because the stereotypes that men are sort of faced with harm them, basically. So it's not an issue of that at all. So I have some questions. I'm in this weird position where, like, So a few questions. Linda, a question from Julie Richmond is, you called the 3 pillars. Could you just repeat that again?
Repeat what the pillars are?
Yeah.
Yes, so they are...
I'm like trying to moderate this, and like I have like I don't know, 100 questions here, so I'm trying.
Yeah, and I'm sensitive that we have just a minute or 2 left, but very quickly, and you could get more information by buying my book, The Working Mother's Guide to Life, but it is, the first pillar is excellent child care, whether it's a licensed child care center, family daycare home, a relative, or a nanny. The second pillar is a partner in parenting, someone who shares both the joys of parenting and the responsibilities of parenting, and it could be there when you're, we all have those moments where we're about ready to lose it as a parent, and who could be there and help us during those times. And that partner in parenting can be a spouse, a relative, a neighbor, a best friend, but someone who's involved in your child's life on a daily level. When you think of who can pick your child up at school. And then the final is a supportive employer, someone who recognizes that you have a whole life, a full life at home and at work, and can support you. And achieving that fullness of life. So whether or not the whole company is supportive is less important than if your immediate supervisor is supportive.
Thank you so much.
Those are the three.
So one last question I think I'm just going to end with is a question that I got from one of the people that are logging into this webinar. And the question is, do you speak differently at home than at work, even if both of those styles are authentic to you?
Well, this is Linda. I'm absolutely the same at home and at work, and I think, you know, for all of us, women and men, to try to really bring our full selves into the workplace as well as at home, I think is what we all hope to achieve in our lives.
Yeah, this is Beth. I would agree with that. I was actually, I'm smiling because I do think that I would have answered that differently much earlier in my career, where I was trying so hard to have my communication style conform to the investment banking norm and the management consulting norm that I experienced earlier in my career. That's no longer the case. So I think my communication styles is very similar both at home and at work. What I try to do is not use up all my patience at work so that I can show up at home and have the same patience for my family that I tried to show to my colleagues. And that's a little bit of the challenge for me.
This is Brandy. That's actually, I've written down that piece of advice, Beth. I'm going to try that. But I would say the same for me also. And one thing I've tried to do for a long time actually is talk about my work and how much it means to me and so forth. In part, I think, because I did, when the kids were younger, got questions about, you know, well, so-and-so's mom doesn't work and so forth. And I want them to know it's something, you know, I do for myself, I do for our family, you know, and to know it's a good thing.
Thank you so much. I have so many questions for all of you, but I'm just trying to figure out, are we finished with this?
Tori, why don't we have one more question?
Sure, yeah. Should I get one of the questions from the audience?
That'd be great.
Of course. There are a lot of questions. So I think that one of the questions that keeps coming up from the audience is, again, actually not related to families, but mainly just how to sort of be a young woman in an organization that doesn't necessarily support feminist ideals. And so I'm just curious, like, if you have, any of you have advice for these women that are you know, signing into this webinar and really care about these issues. You know, how should they behave? What should they do? That's the thing that keeps coming up, not only in the questions, but again, as I've said before, among my MBA students.
This is Beth. I'll just offer one thought. It's very difficult early in one's career to know exactly what one's passion is and where the career path is going to go. As much as we would like to think we have a grand plan, it's hard to know that early career. I started my career in investment banking, went to management consulting, and now work in HR, and I never could have imagined that. And so what I think is important, what we can know and be clear about early in our career is our values. What's important to us and what do we care about, and to choose an organization, choose a firm or a company to be a part of whose values, whose purpose, whose reason for being, and whose culture is aligned with our own, and ideally one with some good growth prospects so that it's possible to think about building a career through multiple different roles in an organization in a place where values are very well aligned.
I agree with that, and I think that's a great note to end on.
Thanks, everyone. I think that's all the time we have. So thank you to Tori and our panelists, and thank you all for joining us. Please send any additional comments or questions to yalesom@som.yale.edu. A recording of this discussion will be made available at the Yale SOM alumni portal, alumni.som.yale.edu, and also at qn.som.yale.edu. Thanks very much.